Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our first Friday Public Affairs call. I'm Steve Jappinga, Senior Vice President of Public Affairs at the Lansing Regional Chamber of Commerce. These monthly calls are designed to keep our members informed, engaged on federal, state, regional policy issues shaping the greater Lansing business climate. Special thank you to ITC Holdings for their continued partnership in making these conversations possible. As a reminder, today's call is being recorded, so all the information shared is as current as of March 6, 2026. We all know that things can change in an hour, couple minutes, couple seconds, but just wanted to make sure I mentioned that. And then before we welcome our special guest today, I wanted to provide just a couple brief updates from our Chamber's public affairs team. First, we currently have a survey out to Lansing Regional Chamber members focused on the local regulatory climate across our region. If you have not done so already, we strongly encourage you to take a few minutes to complete the survey. Your feedback is incredibly important as we continue working with our local units of government to make our region an even better place to do business. So I'll probably put that in the chat for those that are on here, but please be aware of that. And then just again, quick on economic development updates, because I know we've been talking a lot about these. First, the Deep Green data center proposal in Lansing continues to go through the Lansing process. It recently just was approved by the Lansing Planning Commission on the rezoning application. So that is going back to Lansing City Council. So the final vote on that will be April 6, 2026, and then look for communications out from our team on ways to communicate with Lansing City Council members on that project. And then second, down the street from here in East Lansing, the proposed Howard redevelopment project, another significant potential investment and growth within the region. I think March 25th, there's a special vote on that. We're going to be getting information out specifically to our members in the city of East Lansing, but it's definitely a regional issue that we should all be very supportive of. We've seen the development occurring in downtown East Lansing and how favorable that has been. Obviously, there's still challenges, but just wanted to kind of keep everybody up to date on those two items. So with that, excited and pleased to welcome our special guest this morning, Zach Gorchow, President of Michigan Operations for Gongwer News Service. I know many of you know Zach or have heard Zach. He always does a fantastic job on giving us kind of the gameplay of what's happening down at the Capitol. If you're not a subscriber, by the way, to Gongwer News Service, I highly recommend it. I know I read it every single day, and they do a great job of just providing as much information as possible of what's going on at the state legislature on the federal side, obviously local too issues. But Zach, great to have you on here. I will spotlight you for the group, and I guess for the group too. There's a lot that Zach could talk about, so he's going to provide as much as he can. But on some of the political stuff, we'll probably have him back on to talk about the midterms because there is so much happening on that front as well. But with that, Zach, great to see you. The screen is yours.
All right. Well, thanks a bunch for that really nice introduction, Steve, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be with you. I always look forward to talking with the Lansing Chamber and its great members, and we're proud to say we're one of them. So we'll get started with this. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of where things stand as the legislature has kicked off the year and what kind of we're seeing and what we're expecting. I think there's kind of two different stories that are going on right now. I think the first one, of course, as always, in the first 6 months of the year involves the budget. And I think from a timing standpoint, things are looking much different than last year. And I think everyone would say much better. As you probably know, last year, the budget did not get done on time. It was completed about a week after the start of the fiscal year on October 1. It was a heck of a mess. I don't think anybody wants to go through that again, whether you're in the system, whether you're working with the system, or whether you're like me and covering the system. And I think what we're seeing so far this year are a couple of encouraging signs. One, the governor has really stepped up the pressure verbally on the legislature to get this done by June 30th, which of course is the law. Even though the fiscal year doesn't start until October 1, state law does require the legislature to get all the budget bills to the governor's desk by July 1. So she's stepped up the pressure on that. But more importantly, the House, which is controlled by the Republicans, and was really the reason things took as long as they did last year, because the House opted not to pass its own budget bills until June, August, really, really late in the game relative to the usual schedule, is now signaling it's going to move on more of a normal schedule. They have passed around what we call target numbers to the chairs of the appropriations subcommittees, which is essentially telling the people who write each budget, here's how much money you have to work with. That didn't happen until way into 2025. So the fact that members have those numbers at the start of March is a sign that they're looking to move much faster. Further, there was a strong indication from the chair of the House Appropriations Committee, Representative Ann Boland, she's from Brighton, that the House Republicans will move their version of the budget, maybe not right before the 2-week adjournment at the end of March, but soon thereafter. That's on the normal schedule. The typical schedule is the House and Senate pass their versions of the budget sometime in late March, April, or maybe early May. And then in mid to late May and June is when the governor, the House, and the Senate come together and they reconcile the differences they have and they get the budget done by the end of June. So if the House decides this year it's going to get its proposed budgets done in April, that says to me there's a really good chance this gets done on time. So then we go to the substance of it, though, which is probably more important than the timing, but we're all from Lansing, and we know the way the Capitol operates often hinges upon when the budget gets done. The big item we're seeing right now is the governor has proposed quite a few tax increases in the budget this time. This is very different. The last time the governor really proposed a substantial tax increase was her first year in office, when she proposed that 45 cents per gallon fuel tax increase. Never got off the ground. And she's really been quite, I think, gun shy about seeking new revenues ever since. But there is a big Medicaid problem. With the changes the federal government has made, the state has over $1 billion less to work with. And that almost all implicates Medicaid. So what the governor has proposed is what I will call a variety of sin taxes of about $800 million worth that would all go toward Medicaid if passed. So these are an increase in the cigarette tax, an increase to the tobacco tax, a new tax on vapes, a new digital advertising tax, and a variety of increased and new taxes on gambling. And so what do all those things have in common? Well, like I said, they're all kind of these sin taxes. Well, what was the governor able to get through the legislature last year? It was a new wholesale tax on marijuana to fund the roads. And that seemed to be, the Republicans control the House. Many of them have taken the no tax pledge and said we won't vote for a tax increase, but they got that through there. And it almost didn't seem that difficult. Marijuana's not a terribly popular industry in the legislature. So historically, raising the cigarette tax has been a gettable tax increase. Vapes are not particularly popular in the legislature. Gambling, we'll see. Digital advertising, we'll see. The Speaker of the House, Matt Hall, Republican, has basically said, no, we're not raising taxes as part of this budget. We're going to cut spending to bring spending in a line with available revenues. So we'll see. That doesn't seem to bode well, but that's the direction the governor was going. The other thing she did for the first time is she proposed a withdrawal from the state's rainy day fund. This is the budget stabilization fund. It's what you and me might think of as a savings account. There's $2 billion in it. I don't have $2 billion in my savings account, though. That would be nice. But this is what the state uses for when there's an economic downturn or something unexpected, where it's basically saying, okay, we don't think this is a long-term change in revenues falling. Let's just patch the hole here to get through this year. Well, the governor for the first time said, let's use $400 million of that again for Medicaid. Um, Speaker again said no to that. So that's really, to me, the ball game on this budget is how is Medicaid addressed? Do the House Republicans insist on cutting back services in Medicaid, cutting back eligibility, the kinds of things you would need to do to find $1.2 billion dollars? Or is there some willingness to find revenue, whether that's in new taxes or the Budget Stabilization Fund, to patch Medicaid until that is the biggest issue to resolve in the budget. But of course, there are a lot of other issues not getting as much attention, but I think are points where a lot of stakeholders and groups are concerned. The governor proposed no increase in funding, just same funding as the current year for next year for the state's public universities, the state's community colleges, and revenue sharing aid to local governments, cities, villages, townships, counties. Um, this has, caused some consternation. Everyone knows that while inflation has slowed down, it is still very much a thing. And even if inflation has slowed, people are still trying to adjust to how much more things cost. And of course, those costs affect universities, colleges, local governments, and so forth. So if you don't change the amount of aid they get from the state, that puts more pressure on those entities to, in the case of the universities, raise tuition. In the case of the colleges, raise tuition and maybe seek new property taxes. And of course, in the case of local governments, to seek property taxes. Of course, this is one of the reasons why state government sometimes um, puts the clamps on funding to those groups, because there's an awareness, well, they have these other sources of revenue they can go to if it's so important. Um, from a policy standpoint, the overall is, I think, gridlock and great frustration. It doesn't mean nothing's going to happen this year, but with a Democratic majority in the Senate and a Republican majority in the House, and a Speaker of the House and a Senate Majority Leader who really don't like each other, um, there's just been gridlock on what I would describe as low-hanging fruit. I mean, it's not, this isn't a situation where, uh, the Senate Democrats are sitting on a lot of, super partisan Republican legislation from the House, and House Republicans are sitting on a bunch of super partisan Democratic legislation from the Senate. There are, I think, safe to say, scores of bills that have passed each chamber with near unanimous bipartisan support that are going nowhere in the other chamber because of this, um, I guess, to put it politely, just sort of stare down between the two sides, and unwillingness to work with the other and let anybody get a win. Great example, story we had in Gongwer last night. There is an interstate compact for physicians set to Michigan's participation in it is set to expire in a matter of weeks. Basically, it says that if you're licensed to practice in another state, you can practice in Michigan, and vice versa. And there's like 8,000 physicians that this affects. So the House last year passed a bill to extend Michigan's participation in it by several years, and it passed, I think, 106 to 1. Then the Senate passed a bill. This was actually a Republican bill that the Democratic Senate passed. The Senate passed a basically identical bill in May of 2025, almost unanimously. And then the House, for some reason, basically passed an almost identical bill of its own again for sort of a second time last month. I think it was 102 to 2. So basically everybody agrees this is needed. And somehow, even though this issue started over a year ago, everyone knew it was coming. There is still not a bill on the governor's desk. And people are just tearing their hair out about this. I mean, it's like everyone knows this is needed. Nobody thinks it's a bad idea. It has nothing to do with partisan, ideology, but it's one example, maybe the best current example of how the dysfunction that is going on between House Republicans and the Senate Democrats and this whole business of who gets credit for the bill, and so forth. So we'll see what happens. But there are a lot of examples like this. I'll give you one other one. Um, Last spring, the Senate passes a bill to change the date when elected township officials actually take office. Now, probably sounds super boring. What's the point of this? Well, right now, township officials, if I recall correctly, are sworn in to begin work something like 5 days after, either 5 days after the election or 5 days after the results are certified. It's very quick. So the Senate, so it's very quick. But as you know, Michigan has passed a number of voting reforms in recent years, one of which is that if you are an overseas military voter or a relative of a military voter overseas, as long as you mail in your ballot by no later than election day, and it is received no later than, I believe, 6 business days after election day, your vote counts. Well, you can see the math doesn't add up anymore. The old statute that says township officials take office 5 days after the election, well, there's votes still being counted under the new law. So this is a problem. Everyone recognizes it. Again, it's a nonpartisan issue. Senate passes a bill to fix this, moves back the swearing in date by a couple weeks. Sits in the House. House then decides we're going to introduce our own bill, passes it overwhelmingly, I think unanimously, last fall. Goes over to the Senate. There is still not a bill on the governor's desk to fix this because of this dysfunction over who should get credit and what should happen. So again, a bill everybody agrees is needed, has nothing to do with partisan ideology, and it's stuck. Now multiply that by like 200 times. That's what's happening, and it has created this bottleneck. And I don't know many people who aren't terribly frustrated with this. That being said, I think there are a couple issues that do seem ripe for some policy action in the legislature this year. One is on the issue of medical debt. This is where, people don't have maybe the best insurance in the world. They go into the hospital, they wind up with $50,000 in out-of-pocket costs. They put it on a credit card or they take out a loan or whatnot. So there's basically a bipartisan recognition, need to do more to keep give people a little breathing room from the creditors here for something like this. This isn't, racking up $50,000 in debt because you couldn't stop buying stuff on Amazon. This is, medical needs. People shouldn't have as much pressure applied to them. Not that the debt would be wiped out, but, protection from garnishment of wages, for example, protection on really high interest rates and so forth. So that is moving through the Senate. There's a Democratic sponsor, Sarah Anthony, of course, everyone knows, local senator, and then Jonathan Lindsay, a very conservative Republican from Coldwater, down near the Indiana border. And they're working together on this. The governor recently, in her State of the State speech, gave her blessing to this issue as well. So I think that one seems to have a lot of potential. Another one that has a lot of potential, which probably a lot of folks in this group would be interested in, is housing, and specifically zoning when it comes to the construction of new housing. There's a bipartisan package of legislation that has been unveiled in the House with Republican and Democratic co-sponsors to, depending on your point of view, streamline zoning regulations or preempt local control of zoning. So as you can probably guess, the construction industry and housing advocates would call it streamlining, and local governments see it as preempting local control. They're mounting a counterattack on this um, as taking away the ability of local governments to decide on proper zoning regulations for their communities. So I think that one maybe becomes a little tougher because of the local government resistance. But again, the governor has given her blessing to this. We have Republicans in the House and Democrats in the House saying this is a good idea. So those are two issues I'm watching for to get some traction this year. So I've talked for a bit, so maybe I'll pause there. I want to leave some time for questions, and maybe if Steve, if there's anything you want to ask, feel free
Yeah,
to.
thank you, Zach. Appreciate that. And if anybody on this call does have a question, just throw it in the chat box. But Zach, going back on the budget side of things, I've been, this week especially receiving, from several different members, they're putting in requests at both the federal and state for work projects or whatever that may be, but maybe touch a little bit on what happened late last year on those work projects and what that kind of looks like for this go
So,
around.
Steve, are you wondering about the process of getting new like earmarked items for local
Yeah.
projects, that kind of thing?
Yes.
Okay. So, in the about the last 8 years or so, in particular, legislators have put in requests for projects locally. So, like the Moores River Park pool restoration. I don't remember if it was Waverly High School, if it was like a new building or renovation. Something over in the Waverly district would be a good example locally, among other things. So, these are items that local stakeholders say, you know what, this is a critical need. We could really use some help from the state on this. And their local legislator will put in a request for it. Well, a lot of these are worthy items, but over the years, some very, I would say, questionable items have gotten through, sometimes to kind of the fly-by-night nonprofits. So, like, not the good nonprofits that are out there. Most nonprofits out there are a tremendous part of the community doing great work, but sometimes you have an individual without the best intentions creates their own nonprofit or their own company for the sole purpose of getting one of these grants and pretty much uses it to feather their own nest. We've seen two or three examples of this, thankfully, as far as we know, not in the Lansing region. And so there was a lot of pushback on saying, you know what, there has to be better vetting of this. This can't just be what we've done in the past, which is usually overnight, in the wee hours of the morning when the legislature pieces together the budget, there are winners and losers on these earmarks, and some of them get tucked into the budget, and nobody knows about it until they're already passed and going to be signed into law. So the big change last year, which was led by Speaker Hall in the House, is to say if you want one of these projects, you have to make a request in writing. I believe it's 40 days before the bill can be passed. So, in other words, if someone out there said, you know what, Oldsmobile Park really needs an upper deck. I'm just making something up. And it's just too much for the owner of the stadium to do. And so then Sarah Anthony says, okay, I agree with that. It's a good idea. She would need to put that request in writing 40 days before the bill could pass. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to get into the bill, but it can't get into the bill without the request being made and it being publicly known. So the idea is to put some sunshine on these requests, allow time for the public, people like me in the news media to vet these other members of the legislature to look at them and say, is this a good idea or not? Okay, is this person, this company, who are they? How long have they existed? They're requesting $10 million. What's up with that? So it's you can still request these projects, but there's some transparency measures to provide a little more protection for tax dollars now.
Yeah, thank you on that. We did have a question come in, and I'll read it here. So this goes back to the policy. So regardless of the merits of the policy, it comes down to who gets credit. If so, do bill packages that have a Dem senator and a GOP rep as sponsors have the best luck of passing? And are those bills that you just discussed the ones we should watch the most?
So I would say yes to all of that, but yet that also doesn't seem to be working because a lot of smart lobbyists in this town, and they knew when you have a Senate controlled by one party and a House controlled by the other. This is not the first time this has happened. There's a lot of experienced hands around town in the lobbying world who know, okay, this means anything we want to do needs to split up the content of the legislation between a Democratic senator and a Republican member of the House. And somehow that still doesn't seem to be unlocking action. That it's still, it still ultimately seems to come down to this personality conflict between Senator Brinks, Senate Majority Leader Brinks, and Speaker Hall. Um, it also seems Speaker Hall has sort of taken pride in the idea that there were the fewest public acts were signed into law of the history of the state in 2025, and not that more acts means more, better policy. I mean, we've seen, you might have there may be an idea that could be in one bill and it gets carved up into 20 just to spread the credit around. So that's 20 acts instead of one. So it's not that more is better. I don't want people to think I'm saying that. But it also feels like the reverse could be true too, that like why artificially limit the number of public acts just to say you did that? It's a little hard to reconcile when there are bills of Speaker Hall's members, things Speaker Hall supports that are not moving. So I don't know why that hasn't been enough to unlock things, but it seems to come back to this personality conflict. It seems to come down to some like real raw political calculations, on that interstate physicians compact item I mentioned. The Republican sponsor of that legislation is State Representative Riley Linting. She's from Wyandotte. It's a 50-50 district. I mean, I don't know this, but one can certainly speculate that maybe the Senate Democrats don't want her to get the bill because they'd like to unseat her next time, and that's why the Senate Democrats were like, we're gonna run our Senate Republican bill on this issue. It's not even like the Senate Democrats are pushing one of their members' bills. They actually ran a bill from Senator Houck, from a Republican from Mount Pleasant, on the same thing. So it's a really sometimes hard to. Sometimes you feel like you need an abacus to try to resolve what's going on here.
All right. Well, not seeing any other questions. I know we're at the that time. It always goes so fast. But Zach, I appreciate you providing as high level as possible, both on the budget and policy side of things. But yeah, that's very troubling on just yeah, those usual I don't even want to call them tactics, but just having both of those sides be able to work on those issues. I remember working on that issue on the with the physicians when I was at the medical society years ago. So it's just like this is like a no-brainer, easy one to get done. It's going to help patients access, etc. But do appreciate your updates and just all the reporting that you and the team do down the street here. So we do appreciate that and your time today. So
Great to be here.
yep. With that, everybody have a great rest of your day and take care.
Bye, everyone.